Well, water should not be warm in October. Not on a Colorado ridge at 9,000 feet, where frost already painted the stones white each morning, and breath turned to mist before it left the mouth. Cormac Whitmore pressed his palm flat against the moss-covered rim and felt it. Not the cold of mountain stone. Something else entirely. Something breathing up from below. Beside him, Copper whined. The 4-year-old hunting dog had belonged to their grandmother, and in the 3 months since Maeve Whitmore's passing, the dog had attached himself to the brothers with the quiet devotion of an animal who understood loss. Now Copper stood at the edge of the old well, his copper-colored fur bristling along his spine, his nose pointed down into the darkness, and that whine came again. Low and continuous, the sound of a creature recognizing something his masters had not yet seen. Declan leaned over the rim and peered into the black circle below. He was the younger twin by 11 minutes, though no one looking at them would have guessed which came first. Both stood tall, both carried the lean build of young men raised on farm work. Both had inherited their grandmother's gray-green eyes that seemed to change color with the weather. But where Cormac kept a small notebook in his coat pocket and wrote down everything that needed remembering, Declan moved through the world with a different kind of attention. He noticed things that had no practical purpose, the way light fell through aspen leaves at certain hours, the particular call of a meadowlark at dusk, the fact that certain places felt alive when they should have felt dead. This well felt alive. "There is a sound," Declan said quietly. "Do you hear it?" Cormac listened. At first, nothing but wind. Then beneath that wind, beneath the distant call of a hawk circling the valley below, he heard it. A low, steady rush. Not loud, not obvious. The sound of water moving somewhere far beneath them. Water that had no business being there, on a ridge that everyone in Elkshade Basin had dismissed as dry and worthless. Neither brother stepped back. Copper pressed closer to Declan's leg, his body tense, his ears forward. The dog had been acting strangely all morning, reluctant to leave the brothers' sides, alert to sounds and smells that seemed to exist only for him. Now his whine shifted into something else. Not fear, anticipation, as if he knew what waited below and was impatient for his masters to discover it. The October sun climbed higher, burning off the morning frost, but the warmth rising from the well remained constant. Cormac could feel it against his face now, a gentle exhalation from the darkness, the breath of the earth itself. 3 months, he thought. 3 months since the funeral. 3 months of questions with no answers. And now this. The funeral had been held on a Tuesday in July, the hottest day of the summer, when the sky was white with heat and the grasshoppers sang in the fields like a choir of the damned. Maeve Whitmore had been buried in the small cemetery behind the Methodist church, next to the husband she had outlived by 20 years, in a grave marked with a simple stone that bore only her name and the years of her birth and death. 1833 to 1887. 54 years, a lifetime that had begun in Ireland during the worst famine in that country's history and ended in Colorado during one of the most prosperous periods the territory had ever known. Between those 2 points lay a story that Maeve had rarely told, a journey that most people in Elkshade Basin knew only in fragments and rumors. She had survived the Great Hunger. That much was common knowledge. She had come to America alone at 17, worked as a domestic servant in Boston, married a farmer named Whitmore who brought her west, buried that farmer when she was 34, and raised their daughter Bridget on her own while running a farm that should have broken her. She had not broken, she had built, and when she died, she had left behind a mystery that no one in the family could explain. Pastor Josiah Brennan had read the will aloud in the front parlor of the Whitmore farmhouse, his voice carrying the practiced solemnity of a man who had delivered such news many times before. The room smelled of candle wax and grief. Flies buzzed against the windows, seeking escape from the heat. Bridget Whitmore sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face composed in the careful stillness of a woman determined not to weep in front of neighbors. Her husband Garrett stood by the window, looking out at the fields his wife's mother had worked for 37 years. "The main property," Pastor Brennan read, "passes to my daughter Bridget and her husband Garrett, to be held in trust for future generations." This surprised no one. The Whitmore farm in Elkshade Basin was productive land. Good bottom land with reliable water and soil that had been improved through decades of careful management. Everyone expected it to pass to the family. But the 40 acres on the upper ridge, Pastor Brennan continued, and here his voice took on a note of confusion, as if he suspected the document of containing an error, are to be given directly to my grandsons, Cormac and Declan Whitmore, to be held in their names alone, with no conditions except that they see it for themselves, before making any decisions about its future. A murmur went through the small gathering. People shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. Silas Thornwood, who owned the largest ranch in the basin and had attended the reading out of what he called neighborly respect, leaned forward in his chair. He was 55 years old, silver-haired, with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to having his opinions treated as facts. His wife Cordelia sat beside him, her face arranged in an expression of sympathetic concern that did not quite reach her eyes. That ridge land, Silas said, speaking to the room as if Pastor Brennan had not been in the middle of reading, is worthless. Rocky ground, no timber worth cutting, no soil worth plowing, no water to speak of. I offered to buy it from Maeve 3 years ago for a fair price, and she refused. He paused, letting his words settle into the silence. I assumed she was being sentimental. Perhaps she was simply confused in her final years. Bridget's hands tightened in her lap, the knuckles going white, but she said nothing. Cordelia Thornwood leaned toward the woman beside her and whispered something. The woman nodded. The whisper traveled around the room like a small fire, leaving knowing glances in its wake. Cormac, standing against the wall with his brother, felt something cold move through him. Not anger exactly, something quieter and more dangerous. The recognition that this man, who had known their grandmother for decades, who had sat at her table and eaten her food and called her neighbor, understood nothing about her at all. Maeve Whitmore had not been confused. Cormac knew this with absolute certainty, the way he knew the sun would rise tomorrow and the seasons would turn. His grandmother had survived the Great Famine in Ireland when she was 12 years old. She had watched her parents die of hunger and fever. She had watched her brothers and sisters die one by one until she was the only one left. She had walked through a landscape of death to reach a port where ships still sailed, and she had crossed an ocean alone, a child among strangers, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the knowledge in her head. A woman like that did not become confused. A woman like that did not give gifts without reason. But Cormac said nothing. He had learned from his grandmother that silence, sometimes, was its own kind of answer. That the people who talked most understood least. That the truth had a way of revealing itself to those patient enough to wait. His grandmother had been patient. She had waited 54 years to give them this inheritance. He could wait a little longer to understand why. After the reading, Silas Thornwood approached the brothers in the yard. The sun was merciless, the air thick with heat and the smell of horses and dust. Silas's son Virgil, 22 years old and wearing the easy confidence of a young man who had never been denied anything, stood slightly behind his father, his arms crossed, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Boys," Silas said, and the word carried a weight that made clear he did not consider them men. "I want you to understand something. That ridgeland has been nothing but a tax burden for your grandmother since she acquired it. She held on to it out of stubbornness. God rest her soul, but there is no sense in you two making the same mistake." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "I am prepared to offer you $200 for the full 40 acres, he said. "That is more than fair for land that produces nothing and never will." Cormac looked at the document. $200 was real money, enough to buy livestock, to improve the family farm, to set themselves up for the future. And the ridgeland, as far as anyone knew, truly was worthless. No one had ever built anything there. No one had ever tried, but his grandmother had given it to them, not to their parents, to them, specifically and deliberately, with a single condition, that they see it for themselves before making any decisions. "Thank you for the offer," Cormac said. His voice was quiet but steady. "We will consider it after we have visited the land." Silas's expression shifted slightly, the polite mask slipping just enough to reveal something harder beneath, something that did not appreciate being made to wait. "Do not take too long," he said. Winter comes early at that elevation, and offers do not last forever. He turned and walked away, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. Virgil lingered a moment longer, looking at the brothers with undisguised contempt. $5, Virgil said. I will bet anyone $5 that you two are crawling back to sell before the first snow. He laughed, a short, sharp sound. Living on that rock pile. What a joke. He followed his father to their horses. Martha Kincaid, their mother's cousin, had been watching from the porch. She was 28, sharp-tongued, and had never made any secret of her opinion that Maeve Whitmore's land should have been divided more equitably among the family. Her own inheritance had been a set of silver spoons and a quilt, and she mentioned this fact whenever possible. Poor boys, she said, loud enough for half the mourners to hear. Your grandmother loved you best, and this is what she leaves you, a pile of rocks and a death sentence. Perhaps she hated you after all. Several people laughed. It was the kind of laughter that pretended to be sympathetic while hiding something cruel underneath. Declan's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides, but Cormac put a hand on his brother's arm. Come, Cormac said quietly. We have work to do. They walked away from the house, from the mourners, from the whispers and the laughter, and neither of them spoke again until they were alone in the barn, with only the horses and Copper for company. She gave it to us for a reason, Declan said finally. His voice was rough with emotion. She was not confused. She was never confused about anything in her life. No, Cormac agreed. She was not. So what do we do? Cormac was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, We do what she asked. We go see it for ourselves. When? Cormac looked out the barn door at the distant ridge, blue-gray against the summer sky. Soon, he said, before anyone can tell us what to think about it. But August came and went, and September followed, and still they did not go. The farm demanded attention. Hay needed cutting and storing before the weather turned. Fences needed mending where the winter had weakened them. A cow went lame and had to be nursed back to health. The rhythms of agricultural life did not pause for grief or curiosity, and both brothers understood that their parents needed help more than the boys needed answers about a worthless inheritance. But at night, alone in the room they had shared since childhood, Cormac found himself thinking about the will, about the specific phrasing, see it for themselves, not sell it, not improve it, not even live on it, just see it. His grandmother had never wasted words. Every sentence she spoke, every instruction she gave, carried weight. She was not the kind of woman who made requests out of sentiment. What did she want them to see? It was in early October, while helping his mother sort through Maeve's belongings, that Cormac found the answer. Or rather, the beginning of an answer. The box was made of oak, old and dark with age, the lid carved with a pattern he recognized from the stories his grandmother had told when he was young. Celtic knots, she had called them. The patterns of the old country, the designs that had decorated the churches and the standing stones, and the manuscripts created by monks in an age before memory. The box had been hidden at the bottom of a trunk, beneath layers of old linens and clothing that smelled of lavender and thyme. Cormac almost missed it. His hand brushed the carved surface, and something in him went still. He waited until his mother left the room to check on dinner. Then he opened the box. Inside, beneath a faded ribbon and a pressed flower that crumbled at his touch, he found a letter. The paper was yellowed with age. The ink faded to brown, but the handwriting was still legible. Strong, clear letters that had been written with care. October 14th, 1871. Dear Mrs. Whitmore, the work is complete. The chambers are finished according to your specifications, with the water channel running as you described, and the cold room positioned to take advantage of the natural temperature gradient. I confess I did not fully understand your design when we began, but now that I have lived in the space through one season, I see the wisdom of it. The old ways, as you said, know things we have forgotten. I have carved my name into the stone as we agreed, along with a message for whoever might find this place in years to come. I hope they understand, as I have come to understand, that some knowledge is too valuable to be lost. With respect and gratitude, Ezekiel Grayson Cormac read the letter twice, then a third time, then once more slowly, making sure he understood every word. Chambers, specifications, a water channel, a cold room. His grandmother had not left them worthless land. She had left them something else entirely, something hidden, something built according to her design by a man named Ezekiel Grayson, whoever that was. Something waiting. He found Declan in the barn, brushing down one of the horses, and showed him the letter without speaking. Declan read it slowly, his lips moving slightly, the way they always did when he concentrated. When he finished, he looked up at his brother with an expression Cormac had not seen before. Wonder and confusion, and something that might have been fear, all mixed together. Chambers, Declan said. Underground chambers, built in 1871, 16 years ago. And she never told anyone? Cormac shook his head. She kept it secret. All this time. Why? The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable. Declan looked at the letter again, then at Copper, who had followed Cormac into the barn, and now sat watching them with his head tilted to one side, as if he too were trying to understand. "We need to go up there," Declan said. "Tomorrow." Cormac nodded. "We should bring him," Declan said, gesturing at Copper. "She would have wanted that." "Yes," Cormac agreed, "she would." They left before dawn, riding up through the aspens as the sky turned from black to gray to pale gold. The trail grew steeper as they climbed, the vegetation thinning, the air growing sharp with the first bite of approaching winter. Frost sparkled on the grass and on the fallen leaves, turning the world into something crystalline and strange. Copper ran ahead, then circled back, then ran ahead again, his tail high, his movements quick with the joy of a dog in the mountains. He seemed to know where they were going. He seemed eager to get there. By the time they reached the ridge, the sun was fully up, burning away the frost, revealing the true character of the land Silas Thornwood had called worthless. Rocky ground, yes. Steep slopes, yes. No timber suitable for lumber, no flat land suitable for farming or building. But there was something else, something Cormac noticed as they dismounted and began to explore on foot. The ridge was not random, it had been shaped, subtly in ways that would be invisible to anyone not looking for them, but shaped nonetheless. Drainage channels had been cut into the stone to direct water away from certain areas. A natural depression had been enhanced, deepened, turned into something that might once have been a path. And in the center of the 40 acres, hidden behind a stand of scrub oak that had been allowed to grow wild, stood the well. Copper found it first. He stopped at the edge of the stone circle and began to bark, short, sharp sounds of excitement and recognition. His tail wagged furiously. He looked back at the brothers as if to say, "Here, this is what we came for." The well stood perhaps 4 feet tall and 6 feet across, built from stones fitted together without mortar, in a technique Cormac had seen only in pictures of old European construction. The moss covering it was deep green and gray, ancient-looking, as if the structure had grown from the ground rather than been placed upon it. There was no bucket, no rope, no sign that anyone had drawn water from this well in years, but the smell rising from below was mineral and damp, not stale, not the smell of an abandoned shaft, the smell of something that moved, something alive. "This is it," Declan said softly, "whatever she wanted us to find. It is down there." Cormac leaned over the rim and felt the warmth rising, faint but unmistakable. Heat where there should have been cold. Life where there should have been only stone and darkness. "I will go down," Cormac said. "I will go first." "No," Declan said. "I will." Cormac started to argue, but something in his brother's face stopped him. A certainty, a recognition, as if Declan knew somehow that this was his role to play, that he was meant to be the one who descended into the darkness first. "The rope," Cormac said instead, and he began securing their climbing line to one of the stone outcroppings near the well, testing it twice to make sure it would hold. Declan climbed over the rim and began his descent. Copper stood beside Cormac, watching, his body tense, his whine continuous. The dog wanted to follow. He was not afraid. He was impatient. The shaft was wider than it appeared from above, wide enough that Declan's shoulders did not brush the sides. That was the first thing that struck Cormac as deliberate. A well dug for water did not need to be this wide. Something else had been intended. 20 feet down. 25. The pale circle of Declan's face looked up at Cormac from the darkness, growing smaller with each moment. Then Declan's voice floated up, carrying strangely a round resonance to it that was not quite an echo, more like the sound returning from a large and empty room. Oh, one word, but the quality of it, the held breath behind it, the wonder and the disbelief, made Cormac grip the rope tighter. "What?" he called down. "What do you see?" A long pause. Cormac could hear his brother breathing, could hear the faint sound of water somewhere below. Then Declan said quietly, "Cormac, you need to come down here. If you have ever received something from a grandparent that everyone else said was worthless, if you have ever been told that what you inherited had no value, I want you to think about this moment. Two brothers, standing at the edge of a discovery that would change everything they thought they knew. Sometimes the greatest gifts do not look like gifts at all. Sometimes they look like 40 acres of rock and a hole in the ground." Cormac secured the rope around his own waist and descended. The shaft smelled of moss and cold mineral, and beneath that, something warmer, the particular damp warmth of moving water and enclosed stone. He went down 20 feet before his boots found not dirt, not rock, but wood, a plank floor, smooth and solid beneath his weight. He let himself stand on it and looked up at the circle of pale morning sky above him. It seemed impossibly far away, a window into another world. Then he looked around. He was standing inside a room, not a cave, not a natural formation, a room. Stone walls fitted with the same careful, mortarless technique as the well shaft above. Every stone chosen and placed with precision, the walls nearly plumb. The ceiling supported at intervals by short sections of timber dry and hardened with age. The floor was wooden planking, gray with time but unrotted, the boards overlapping in a pattern that allowed air to circulate beneath. The air he stood in was cool but not cold, noticeably, measurably warmer than the ridge above. Declan stood 20 feet away, at the edge of a low stone channel. He was looking down into it with an expression of pure amazement. Cormac walked to where his brother stood and looked down. Water, running clear and fast over shaped stone, not a trickle, not seepage, a proper stream, channeled deliberately, flowing from one end of the room to the other and disappearing through a carefully cut opening in the far wall. "There is more," Declan said. His voice was hushed, almost reverent. "There are other rooms." They explored together, moving slowly, taking in every detail. The main living space was 20 feet by 14, smaller than their parents' front room, but proportioned cleverly, the ceiling high enough in the center to stand upright without stooping. The walls were curved slightly at the base, a design choice that seemed aesthetic until Cormac realized its practical purpose. No corners meant no places for cold air to pool, no places for moisture to collect and breed rot. Beyond the main room, through a low doorway cut into the stone, lay the food cellar. 8 feet by 10, noticeably colder than the main space, cold enough that Cormac could see his breath. Stone shelf brackets had been built into the walls at regular intervals, sized to hold jars and crocks and baskets. The water channel passed through one corner of this room, and the sound of its passage filled the space with a constant, gentle rush. "This is why it is cold," Declan said, understanding dawning on his face. "The water. It pulls heat out of the air as it passes through." Cormac nodded. Their grandmother had explained the principle to him once, years ago, when he had asked why the spring house at the farm stayed cool even in summer. Moving water carried warmth away with it. Still air held warmth close. The sleeping room was 12 by 8, positioned at the greatest distance from the water channel. It was warmer than the main room, dry and dark, with a bunk frame built into the wall and a small ventilation shaft that rose straight up through the stone above. When Declan climbed into the shaft to clear decades of debris, leaves and bird nests and small stones, the air in the sleeping room freshened noticeably within the hour. "Every piece of it is connected," Declan said, sitting on the floor of the main room that evening with their lantern burning low. "Everything works together. The water channel keeps the food cellar cold and the main room moderate. The sleeping room is dry because it is farthest from the water. The ventilation shaft brings fresh air but not cold air because it is too narrow for wind to push through." He designed it, Cormac said. Grayson. He must have been a genius. Declan shook his head. She designed it. Our grandmother. Grayson just built what she told him to build. The letter said he did not understand until he had lived in the space for a season. She understood from the beginning. How? How would she have known how to design something like this? Declan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the stories she used to tell. About Ireland. About the old places where her family hid during the famine. Cormac remembered. Fragments of memory, half understood at the time. His grandmother sitting by the fire on winter evenings, speaking of things that had happened when she was young. Underground chambers where food could be stored. Places where people could shelter when everything above ground was death. He had thought they were stories, legends, the kind of tales old people told to pass the time. He had not understood that they were instructions. On the wall opposite the entry shaft, they found the message Grayson had promised. Letters carved deep into the stone. Made to last. E. Grayson, 1871. Built for Maeve, for those who come after, for those who come after. She knew we would find it, Declan said softly. She knew, and she waited. 16 years. She waited for the right time to give it to us. Cormac pulled out his notebook and wrote down everything they had discovered. The dimensions of each room, the temperature differences, the path of the water channel, the position of the ventilation shaft. When he finished, he looked at his brother. We are not selling this land, he said. No, Declan agreed. We are not. In the 4th week of October, they hauled the rest of their supplies down into the underground dwelling. Flour and dried beans, salt pork wrapped in oilcloth, a small tin of lard, 2 good blankets, spare rope, candles and lamp oil, the tools they would need for maintenance and repair. They made trip after trip up and down the shaft, loading the mule, unloading at the well, lowering everything down by rope. Copper went down with them on the 3rd trip. He descended in a canvas sling that Declan rigged, his body tense, his eyes wide. But he did not struggle or whine. When they set him down on the wooden floor, he stood still for a long moment, his nose working, taking in every smell. Then his tail began to wag. He walked the perimeter of the main room, investigating every corner, and finally lay down beside the water channel with a sigh of contentment. He knows, Declan said. He knows this is where we are meant to be. That night they slept in the bunk frame in the sleeping room, with the lantern turned low and the water running somewhere close in the dark. Above them, 40 feet of stone and earth and the cold mountain night. Down here, still air, steady warmth, the smell of clean water and old stone. Cormac lay awake for a long time, listening to his brother's breathing, to Copper's occasional sighs, to the constant gentle rush of the water channel. He thought about his grandmother, about the choices she had made, about the knowledge she had carried across an ocean and held for 40 years, waiting for the right moment to pass it on. She could have told them about this place while she was alive. She could have brought them here, explained everything, shown them how it worked. But she had chosen instead to make them discover it for themselves, to make them earn the knowledge by seeking it out. Why? He did not know, but he trusted her. She had never done anything without reason. Both brothers slept through until morning without once waking. But the underground dwelling was not perfect. 16 years of abandonment had taken their toll, and in the 5th week of October, the problems began to show themselves. The first was the water channel, the portion closest to the entry shaft, where the channel had been cut through a section of the outer stone wall, had developed a slow seep around one fitted joint. Not a flood, a seep, a thin trickle of moisture running down the interior wall and pooling at the base. In dry weather, it might have been ignorable. But in the cold, the seep was beginning to ice, and ice meant expansion, and expansion was how fitted stone came apart. The second problem was the ceiling timbers. 2 of the 3 support sections in the main room showed softness at one end. Not rotted through, but the beginning of rot, where moisture had found its way in over the years and begun its quiet work. The timbers still held. But Cormac was a farmer's son, and he understood what still holds meant and what it did not mean. Still holds meant not yet failed. It did not mean safe. The third problem was light, or rather, the lack of it. They had 2 lanterns and a reasonable quantity of oil, but the ventilation shaft above the sleeping room was the only source of daylight in the entire underground dwelling, and it admitted light only at certain hours of the day. The rest of the time, and especially on overcast days, which at altitude in October was nearly every day, they lived entirely by lantern light. It was manageable, but it was wearing in a way that was slow to name. The eye wanted something real. The mind wanted the sky, even a gray one. Cormac sat with the list of problems in his notebook one evening and ran his thumb down the page. The seep is the urgent one, he said. Declan agreed without argument, which meant he had already reached the same conclusion and was waiting for Cormac to arrive there. If it ices through the joint and forces the stone, we lose the seal on the outer wall. We need to repoint that section. Mortar, Declan said. We do not have mortar. We have limestone. We have water. We have time. Declan looked at his brother across the lantern. You know how to make mortar? I know the principle of it, Cormac said carefully. I watched our father do the fireplace repairs twice. I also watched it done poorly once, by the Hendersons, and I saw what happened when their chimney cracked after one winter. Knowing what not to do is almost as useful as knowing what to do. Declan smiled. A small, real smile, the kind that meant he was genuinely pleased by something. Then we try, he said. They tried the next morning. Cormac gathered the softest of the available limestone chips from the slope above the well, carried them down in buckets, and ground them fine against a flat rock, using a smaller stone as a pestle. The work was tedious and hard on the hands, but it produced a powder that looked approximately right when compared to the mortar dust he scraped from their father's fireplace. He mixed the powder with water in stages, adjusting the consistency until it held together without crumbling and spread without running. Then he applied the resulting paste to the seeping joint, working it in with a stick whittled flat on one end, filling the gap completely, packing it tight. It was rough work. The mixture was imprecise. They watched it for 2 days. It held. Cormac added details to his notebook. The ratio of powder to water, the consistency that worked best, the way the mortar changed color as it cured, from pale gray to almost white, knowledge that might be needed again. The ceiling timbers were harder. What they needed was replacement, or at minimum reinforcement. A new section of dry hardwood braced against the compromised sections to carry the load while the old timber could be removed and replaced. The problem was wood. There was almost no timber on the ridge. The aspens below tree line were green and flexible, unsuitable for load bearing. What they needed was dry season hardwood, and the nearest source of that was 4 miles down the mountain in the lower valley where the family farm sat. Cormac made the trip on a clear day in mid-October, riding down through the aspens with the second mule on lead. The valley looked peaceful from above, the farm spread out along the bottom land, smoke rising from chimneys, the last of the autumn colors lingering in the cottonwoods along the creek. At the farm, he found his father mending fence along the lower pasture. Garrett Whitmore was a quiet man who expressed himself through action rather than words. He listened without interrupting as Cormac described what they had found on the ridge, what they were doing there, what they needed. When Cormac finished, his father was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Your grandmother talked about this once. Years ago, when she first bought that land. She said there was something up there worth having. She said she would know when the time was right. She never told you what it was." Garrett shook his head. She kept her secrets close. But she was never wrong about land. Not once in all the years I knew her. He helped Cormac load 3 sections of dry oak onto the mule, pieces that had been seasoning in the lumber shed since a fallen tree the previous summer. Good wood, saved for fence posts, cut to 6-foot lengths, perfect for what they needed. As Cormac was preparing to leave, his mother came out of the house. Bridget Whitmore looked at the loaded mule, at the wood her sons would carry up the mountain, and her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "She believed in you," Bridget said quietly. "My mother. All those years, she watched you two grow up, and she believed you would understand what she had to give, even when the rest of us could not see it." She pressed a cloth bundle into his hands. Dried beef, a hard cheese, 2 onions, a tin of butter. "You will need to eat," she said, "and when you have made that place what she meant it to be, you will bring me to see it." She paused. "She never let me see it while she was alive. but I think she would want me to see it now. Cormac promised that he would. Then he rode back up the mountain with the wood and the food, and a feeling in his chest that he could not quite name. Pride, perhaps, or responsibility, or the weight of being trusted with something important. The installation of the new timbers took 3 days and required a kind of patience that Cormac had not known he possessed. They had no proper tools for timber work, no broad axe, no proper adze, nothing designed for shaping heavy wood. They had a handsaw, a chisel, and a mallet. They worked by lantern in the low space of the main room, fitting the new oak sections in beside the old timbers, notching them where needed, driving wooden wedges at each end to tighten the fit against the stone above. The work was slow and frustrating. The oak was hard, resistant to their inadequate tools. More than once, a wedge split or a notch cut crooked, and they had to start that section over. On the second day, Declan sat back on his heels and put his face in his hands. Not crying. Something before crying. The deep tire that comes from sustained difficulty when no part of the difficulty is dramatic enough to break into relief. I do not know if we are doing this right, he said. Cormac set down the mallet. This was unusual. Declan was generally the one who believed in the rightness of things before the evidence appeared. The one who saw patterns and purposes where Cormac saw only problems. Hearing doubt from his brother in the small stone room, with the lantern low and the work half done, was different from Cormac's own internal doubts. Tell me what you're afraid of, Cormac said. A long pause. Copper, who had been sleeping by the water channel, lifted his head and looked at them. That we fix everything that is broken, Declan said slowly, and it is still not enough to make a life here. That we work until spring and then look at what we have, and it is still just 40 cold acres of nothing. Only now we have spent half a year proving that. He looked up at his brother. Everyone said this land was worthless. What if they were right? What if our grandmother was wrong about us? Cormac thought about that for a while. The lantern flickered. The water ran in its channel. Copper put his head back down with a sigh. Our grandmother learned something in Ireland that most people have forgotten, Cormac said finally. She learned that the earth itself can shelter you when everything above ground is trying to kill you. That knowledge saved her life when she was 12 years old. It kept her alive when everyone she loved was dying. He paused. She did not give us this place because she was confused. She gave it to us because she believed we would understand what to do with it. Not a farm, not a house in the usual sense. Something else, a keeping place. A place where things that matter can survive the worst that can happen. What things? Cormac looked around the stone room. The water running in the channel, the new oak timber sitting solid against the compromised one, the cold cellar with its stone shelves, the steady, moderate temperature that never varied more than a few degrees regardless of what happened above. I do not know yet, he said, but I think we will figure it out. He picked up the mallet. For now, we finished what we started. They finished the timber work on the third day. When they were done, the ceiling was solid. The old wood and the new wood bore the weight together. It would hold. 3 days after the timbers were set, Cormac woke before dawn to a sound he did not immediately recognize. He lay still in the darkness, listening. Declan was asleep across the room, his breathing deep and regular. Copper lay at the foot of the bunk, his warmth a comfort against the cold. And from above, not from the water channel, not from the ventilation shaft, but from the well shaft itself, the entry point 20 feet overhead, came a low grinding sound. Stone on stone. Cormac was on his feet and holding the lantern high before he was fully awake, staring up the shaft. A crack had appeared in the well casing 6 feet up, a fresh fracture, pale against the dark moss. Cold air poured through it in a steady stream, and he could see frost already forming on the edges of the break. The frost had found them. He did not wake Declan. Not yet. He sat on the floor of the main room with the dying lantern and looked at the crack and thought. The crack was in the well shaft above the living space, not in the dwelling walls themselves. The frost had worked a joint in the upper casing where the stone was older and the exposure greatest. It was not structural in the same way a failed ceiling timber would be. But if it widened, if ice continued to work it through the coming weeks, the shaft could fail. The shaft was their only entrance and exit. It was also their air. He thought about his brother saying, maybe it is still not enough. He thought about Silas Thornwood's offer of $200 for worthless land. He thought about Martha Kincaid's laughter and Virgil's bet, and all the people who were waiting for them to fail. And he thought about Ezekiel Grayson, 16 years gone, who had come up a cold mountain and built this place with his own hands, who had fitted every stone, channeled the water, made the coal do what he needed it to do, who had signed his name into the rock and left a message for whoever might come after. Grayson had died in a mining accident in 1873, according to the few people in the valley who remembered him. He had never seen whether his work would last, but he had built it to last. He had built so well that 16 years later, two brothers climbing down a rope had found something worth keeping. Cormac set the lantern down and picked up his notebook. Fix the shaft from outside. Repoint the upper casing before dawn. He woke Declan at first light, gray and quiet. The coldest morning yet. Their breath made clouds even inside the dwelling. The shaft, Cormac said, and he showed him the notebook. One sentence. The plan. Declan read it, looked up at the crack, looked at Cormac. From above, he said, we would have to work from the rim. In that cold. Yes. Declan was quiet a moment. Then he stood and began pulling on his coat and his heaviest wool socks, moving with the efficiency he had when he had made up his mind. Then we should start, he said. They climbed the shaft in the gray pre-dawn, Cormac first with the remaining mortar mixture in a tin pail, and Declan behind him with the tools. Copper stayed below, and they could hear him barking as they climbed, short, sharp sounds of protest at being left behind. They came out into a cold so hard it took the breath away cleanly and completely, the kind of cold that made the world feel mineral and unforgiving. The ridge was white with frost. The sky to the east was beginning to go pink and orange, and entirely indifferent to their situation. The temperature was well below zero. The wind was light but steady, enough to steal warmth from exposed skin within minutes. Their fingers would go numb quickly. They would have to work fast. Cormac assessed the crack from above. It ran 8 inches along the outer face of the shaft casing, about 3 feet below the rim. A clean fracture along one of the original stone joints, forced by freeze and thaw over 16 winters, and finally widened past tolerance by the previous night's hard cold. The stone on either side of the crack was solid. The crack itself was the problem, and it was a manageable problem if the mortar held. The mortar needed to hold. He worked by feel as much as sight, his fingers going numb almost immediately in the cold, pressing the limestone paste into the crack and working it with the flat stick in long, firm strokes, filling the joint completely, packing it tight. When his hand stopped functioning, he passed the stick to Declan and tucked his fingers under his arms until the feeling began to return. Then he took the stick back and continued. They packed the joint above the crack too, and the joint below it, sealing a full section of the shaft casing against further incursion. Then they spread the remaining paste over the outer rim itself, the section most exposed to weather, the section that had never been pointed since the original construction. It was rough work and cold work, and neither of them spoke much doing it. There was nothing to say. The work was what mattered. The work was the only answer to the cold and the doubt and the voices of everyone who had told them this was a mistake. The sun came fully up while they were finishing. Its light fell across the ridge in long, cold slashes and made the frost brilliant white for a few minutes before the wind came and dulled it again. When they climbed back down, the crack looked like nothing. A faint line, barely visible beneath the fresh mortar, sealed and still. The cold air that had been seeping through it was gone. The shaft was whole again. Copper greeted them at the bottom with a frenzy of wagging and licking, as if they had been gone for days instead of hours. They sat on the floor of the main room and let the dog climb over them, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Declan said, "We did it." Cormac nodded. "This time," he said, "we fixed it this time. And if something else breaks, then we fix that too, as many times as it takes." Declan looked at him. For how long? Cormac thought about his grandmother, about the 40 years she had waited to give them this place, about the knowledge she had carried across an ocean and held in secret, trusting that someday it would be needed. "As long as we have to," he said. "Have you ever faced a moment when everything seemed to be falling apart? When every solution created a new problem and every step forward seemed to lead to 2 steps back? I want you to think about that moment And I want you to think about this. Sometimes the only answer is to keep going, to fix what breaks, to learn what you need to learn, to trust that the work itself will show you the way. The news of what they were doing reached the valley by the end of October. Not through anything the brothers said or did. Through Silas Thornwood, who had ridden up the ridge to check on the progress of what he assumed would be their failure. He found them emerging from the well shaft like miners coming up from a tunnel, dirty and tired and alive in a way he had not expected. They are living in the ground, he told anyone who would listen when he returned to the valley, like animals, like rabbits or moles. The old woman left them a burrow, and they have crawled down into it. I have never seen anything so pathetic in my life. His son Virgil thought it was hilarious. He rode up to the ridge with 3 friends a week later, and they stood at the edge of the well and shouted down into it, laughing and throwing pebbles into the darkness. "Hey, moles!" Virgil called, his voice echoing off the stone. "You still alive down there? Come up and see the sun before you forget what it looks like." His friends laughed. One of them made squeaking noises like a rodent. "I bet you $5 they come crawling back before Christmas," Virgil said to his companions. "No way anyone survives a winter in a hole. My father offered them 200 for this land. They should have taken it when they had the chance." More laughter, more pebbles thrown into the darkness. Below in the main room, Cormac listened without responding. He was checking the temperature of the provisions in the cold cellar, the same way he checked them every morning, recording the numbers in his notebook. Copper stood at the base of the shaft, looking up, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Declan, who was in the sleeping room, came out and looked at his brother. "I could go up," Declan said quietly. "I could say something." "What would you say?" What words would change their minds? Declan did not answer. There were no words. They both knew it. Eventually, Virgil and his friends grew bored. The moles were not providing entertainment. They rode away, their laughter fading into the distance, and the ridge was quiet again. Franklin Hollister came up a few days later, at Silas Thornwood's invitation. Hollister was 42 years old, owned the building supply store in Elkshade Basin, and had built a reputation as an expert in construction, though his expertise was primarily in selling materials to people who did the actual building. He descended the shaft with obvious reluctance, complaining about the rope and the darkness and the damp. He spent 15 minutes walking through the chambers, poking at the walls, examining the ceiling timbers with the air of a man looking for flaws. When he emerged, blinking in the sunlight, his verdict was loud and confident. "No foundation," Hollister announced. "No proper framing, dry stacked stone with no mortar in most places. The ceiling timbers are mismatched and poorly fitted." He shook his head with the satisfaction of a man whose predictions of disaster were about to be confirmed. "This structure will collapse before spring. The frost heave alone will shift those walls. And when it does, anyone down there will be buried alive." He looked at Cormac, who had climbed up to hear the assessment. "I am telling you this for your own good," Hollister said. "I have been building in this territory for 20 years. I know what works and what does not work in this climate. Your grandmother meant well, God rest her soul, but she did not understand construction. This is a death trap." Cormac looked at him for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "The people who built this way constructed structures that lasted 2,000 years. Hollister stared at him. Then he laughed, a short, sharp sound, more disbelief than amusement. 2,000 years, he repeated. In Ireland, perhaps. In some bog where nothing ever freezes properly, where the ground never moves, where they did not have real winters." He gestured at the ridge around them, at the frost-covered stones and the bare aspens and the mountains rising white-capped in the distance. "This is Colorado," he said. "This is not Ireland, and this structure will fail." He looked at Silas Thornwood, who had been watching the exchange with obvious satisfaction. "I tried," he said. "You cannot help people who refuse to listen to reason." They rode away together, leaving the brothers standing at the rim of the well in the thin mountain air. Cormac watched them go without expression. The wind picked up, carrying their voices away, carrying the sound of their horses' hooves until there was nothing but silence. "He does not understand," Declan said finally. "No, he does not. Should we try to explain? Show him the water channel, the temperature differences, the way everything is connected?" Cormac shook his head. Would it matter? Would any explanation change what he already believes? Declan thought about that. No, he admitted, probably not. She told us once, Cormac said. Our grandmother. She told us that the hardest thing about surviving the famine was not the hunger. It was watching people die because they refused to believe that the old ways could save them. They thought they knew better. They thought modern ideas were always superior to ancient knowledge. And they were wrong. They died being wrong. Declan looked at the well, at the fitted stones that Hollister had dismissed as primitive. So we wait, he said. We wait, Cormac agreed. And when the time comes, we show them. Not with words, with results. They climb back down into the earth. In the second week of November, an old man came up the ridge alone. Brennan Gallagher was 72 years old. He had worked the mines in Colorado for 40 years before his lungs gave out and forced him to retire to a small cabin at the edge of Elkshade Basin. He walked with a slight stoop now, and he had to stop frequently to catch his breath, but his eyes were still sharp and his mind was still clear. He was Irish, from Cork. He had come to America the same year as Maeve Whitmore, though they had not known each other in the old country. There were many Irish in the Colorado mountains. The mines had drawn them, and the mountains had kept them. He had heard the stories circulating in town, and about the Whitmore boys living in a hole, about the death trap they were building, about how the old woman had finally been proven crazy. Something about those stories had bothered him, something he could not quite name until he woke one morning and realized what it was. The description of the structure, a fitted stone well leading to underground chambers. No mortar. Built into a hillside. He had seen structures like that before. Not in America. In Ireland, when he was a boy. Before the famine. Before everything changed. He found the brothers at the rim of the well, hauling up a bucket of water from the channel below. Copper stood beside them, watching his approach with the alert stillness of a dog assessing a stranger. You are the Gallagher who worked the Sullivan mine, Cormac said. It was not a question. He had seen the old man at his grandmother's funeral, standing at the back of the church, his hat in his hands. I am. Gallagher looked at the well, at the fitted stones, at the moss growing thick on the north side of the rim. I heard what people are saying about this place. I wanted to see for myself. Cormac studied him for a moment, something in the old man's eyes, a recognition that had not been there in Hollister's eyes, or in Silas Thornwood's, or in anyone else who had come to look. Would you like to go down? Cormac asked. Gallagher descended slowly, his old joints protesting the climb. But when he reached the bottom and stood on the wooden plank floor and looked around at the fitted walls and the running water and the steady, moderate temperature of the air, he went very still. He did not speak for a long time. He walked the perimeter of the main room, his hand trailing along the stone, his breath catching in his throat. He looked at the water channel. He looked at the ceiling timbers. He looked at the doorway leading to the cold cellar. Finally, he said one word. Souterrain. You know what this is, Cormac said. I know exactly what this is. Gallagher turned to face the brothers, and there were tears in his eyes. My grandfather showed me ruins like this in Cork when I was a boy. Ancient places. The old people built them before memory, for storing food, for hiding in times of trouble, for survival when everything above ground was death. He touched the wall again, almost reverently. Some of them are still standing after 2,000 years, he said. 2,000 years, and the fools in the valley are saying this will collapse before spring. He turned and looked at Cormac. Your grandmother was from Ireland. County Clare, Cormac said. Gallagher nodded slowly. She remembered, he said, all these years in America, all these years of people telling her that the old ways were primitive and the new ways were better, and she remembered. She knew what this kind of structure could do. She knew what it was worth. He walked to the water channel and looked down at the clear stream running over shaped stone. The earth holds its temperature steady at this depth, he said. The physics of it. Below the frost line, below the reach of weather, the ground stays constant. Summer or winter, it does not change by more than a few degrees. Your grandmother knew that. Grayson knew that when he built it. He looked up at the shaft, at the circle of gray sky visible at the top. The people calling you fools, he said quietly, do not understand what they are looking at. They see a hole in the ground. They see primitiveness. They see failure. His voice hardened. I see 2,000 years of knowledge, built with hands and stone, and the understanding that sometimes the only way to survive is to go deeper, to let the earth itself protect you from what the weather can do. He turned to Cormac. If you need help with anything, he said, you can find me in the basin. I am too old to climb this ridge often. My lungs do not allow it, but I know stone, and I know what your grandmother was trying to give you. He climbed back up, slowly, painfully. Copper watched him go, tail wagging slightly as if he recognized a friend. When he was gone, Declan looked at his brother. That is the first person, he said, who has understood. Cormac nodded. He pulled out his notebook and wrote down what Gallagher had said. About the Earth's temperature, about the physics, about 2,000 years. It will not be the last, he said. Dr. Phineas Ashford came up the ridge in the third week of November, driven not by kindness but by scientific curiosity. He was 38 years old, educated at a medical college in Philadelphia, and he had heard Franklin Hollister's assessment of the underground dwelling with the particular skepticism of a man who trusted measurements more than opinions. He descended the shaft with a thermometer and a notebook of his own. He spent 3 hours below, moving from room to room, taking readings, measuring the temperature of the water, calculating the approximate volume of air in the living spaces, examining the ventilation system, asking questions that Cormac answered patiently. When he emerged, his expression was thoughtful rather than dismissive. The thermal variance is remarkable, he said, almost to himself. Less than 3 degrees regardless of external conditions. The thermal mass of the stone walls and earth creates stability that would be impossible to achieve with conventional construction methods. He looked at Cormac. Hollister said this would collapse, he said. Hollister sells lumber. He understands wood frame construction. He does not understand thermal mass. He does not understand the physics of earth-sheltered structures. He does not understand that some principles of engineering have been tested for millennia. He paused, looking back at the well. Your grandmother was either a genius, he said, or she learned from people who were. Either way, this structure will not collapse. It will outlast every wooden building in Elkshade Basin. He nodded to the brothers and began his walk back down the ridge. Cormac watched him go, saying nothing, but in his notebook he wrote down everything the doctor had said about thermal mass and physics and the proven principles of engineering. 2 people now, Declan said, who understand. Cormac closed the notebook. We will need more than 2, he said. But it is a start. December came, and with it the first real cold of the winter. The valley below disappeared under snow. The trail up the ridge became treacherous, passable only on foot. The brothers settled into a rhythm of life that felt ancient and new at the same time. They woke with the light that filtered down through the ventilation shaft. They ate breakfast by lantern. They checked the temperature in each room, the water level in the channel, the condition of every joint and timber. They made small repairs as needed. They gathered firewood on clear days, stockpiling it near the well rim for the times when they could not venture out at all. A few families from the valley brought supplies to be stored. The Hendersons, whose root cellar had flooded in the autumn rains. The Marshes, who had lost half their winter provisions to mice. 2 other families whose names Cormac did not recognize, who had heard about the keeping place from someone who had heard it from someone else. They paid modest fees. They hauled their goods up the ridge on clear days and lowered them down the shaft and set them on the stone shelves in the cold cellar. Most of them looked around at the fitted walls and the running water and the steady temperature with expressions of amazement. An older man with a German accent nodded slowly when he saw the structure. Ja, he said. I have seen this before. In the old country. The old people built cellars like this into the hillsides. It works. It always works. He paid double what Cormac asked and told him to keep the extra. For your grandmother, he said. Wherever she is now, she earned it. But most of the valley did not come. Most of the valley listened to Silas Thornwood, who was certain the structure would collapse any day now. To Franklin Hollister, who told everyone that the engineering was fundamentally unsound. To Pastor Josiah Brennan, who had decided that living underground was somehow ungodly, against the natural order that God had established when he created man to walk in the light. At the Basin Social in early December, held in the Thornwood barn as it always was, the brothers became a topic of extended discussion. Martha Kincaid held court near the refreshment table, telling anyone who would listen that her poor cousins had gone mad with grief over their grandmother's death. Living in a hole, she said, shaking her head with theatrical sympathy, like animals, and now they want us to pay them to share it. I have never heard anything so absurd in my life. Cordelia Thornwood, standing nearby, nodded in agreement. Her face was arranged in an expression of concern that did not quite reach her eyes. Those poor boys, Cordelia said. Maeve Whitmore must have hated them, to leave them nothing but a pit in the ground and let them think it was an inheritance. Pastor Brennan, who had been listening, added his own observation. It troubles me, he said, stroking his beard thoughtfully. Living beneath the earth like that, it is unnatural. God made man to walk in the light, to dwell under the sky. There is something pagan about burrowing into the ground. He paused. I have half a mind to ride up there and counsel those boys before they lose themselves entirely. But Brennan Gallagher was at the social too, sitting in a corner with a cup of cider, and he had heard enough. He pushed himself to his feet, his old joints protesting, and walked slowly toward the group. His breathing was labored from the effort, but his voice was strong. You do not know what you are talking about, he said. Any of you. The conversation stopped. People turned to look at the old miner, this relic from another era, who rarely spoke at social gatherings. The Suterins of Ireland, Gallagher said, kept families alive for 2,000 years. Underground chambers built exactly like the one those boys are living in. They sheltered people from invaders. They stored food through famines. They provided refuge when everything above ground was death. He looked directly at Pastor Brennan. Living underground saved more lives during the famine than all your prayers combined, Gallagher said. While the English were burning people out of their homes and the blight was destroying the crops, the ones who survived were the ones who knew where the old places were, the ones who remembered what their grandparents had taught them. His voice dropped, but it carried in the sudden silence. Those boys are not crazy. Their grandmother was not confused. She knew exactly what she was leaving them. And you will all remember this conversation when the hard times come. Because the hard times always come. And when they do, the only thing that matters is whether you prepared for them. He walked out of the barn without looking back. No one said anything for a long moment. Then someone laughed nervously, and someone else made a comment about old men and their stories, and the conversation moved on to other topics. But some people remembered what Gallagher had said, and some people began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the moles on the ridge knew something the rest of them did not. Have you ever been the only person who believed in something? Have you ever held on to an idea that everyone around you dismissed as foolish, as primitive, as wrong? I want you to think about that feeling, the loneliness of it, the weight of it, and I want you to think about this. Sometimes the whole world is wrong, and you are right. Sometimes the knowledge that seems outdated is actually timeless. Sometimes the only thing that matters is whether you have the courage to keep going when everyone tells you to stop. January of 1888 was cold. Colder than any January in recent memory. The temperature dropped below zero on the first day of the month and did not rise above it for 3 weeks straight. In the valley, pipes froze. Livestock died in barns that could not be kept warm enough. Old people and young children developed coughs that turned into pneumonia. The doctor was busy from dawn to dusk, and some nights he did not sleep at all. On the ridge in the keeping place, Cormac recorded the temperature each morning, 52 degrees, 51, 53. The variation was never more than 3 degrees, regardless of what happened above. When it was 20 below zero outside, it was 52 inside. When the wind howled across the ridge at 40 miles per hour, the air in the main room was still and calm. They ate well. They slept well. They worked on small improvements to the structure, things that would make it more livable, more efficient, more permanent. Cormac expanded his notebook into a detailed guide to everything they had learned, every repair they had made, every principle they had discovered. A few more families came to store provisions. Word was spreading despite the skeptics, despite the mockery. People who had lost food to freezing or flooding or mice were willing to try something different. People who remembered the old ways, or who had heard their grandparents talk about the old ways, recognized what the brothers had found. By the end of January, 8 families had goods stored in the keeping place. By the end of February, that number had grown to 11. The brothers were not getting rich. The fees they charged were modest, barely enough to cover the supplies they needed from the valley. But they were building something, a reputation, a service, a reason for the land to exist. A keeping place, Declan said one evening, sitting by the fire with copper at his feet. That is what we should call it. Not a root cellar, not a spring house. A keeping place. A place where things that need to survive can survive. Cormac wrote it down. The first signs came in late February. Brennan Gallagher made the difficult climb up the ridge on a clear morning, moving slowly because his lungs allowed nothing else, and found the brothers at the well rim, doing maintenance on the mortar. "The air feels wrong," he said without preamble. He was breathing hard from the climb, his face pale with the effort. "I have felt this only once before, when I was young, in 1856. He looked at the sky, which was clear and blue and perfectly innocent. "I do not know when," he said, "but it is coming. Something bad. Worse than anything we have seen this winter." He did not stay long. The altitude was too much for his damaged lungs, but his warning stayed with the brothers after he left. Cormac spent the next 3 days hauling extra provisions down the shaft. Firewood, as much as they could stockpile near the well rim. Dried meat and flour and beans. Water containers, though they had the channel. Candles and lamp oil. Everything they could carry. Everything they could think of. Declan watched him work without asking why. He had felt it too. The wrongness in the air. The sense of something gathering beyond the horizon. On the night of March 10th, 1888, Copper would not settle. He paced the main room, whining, his nails clicking on the wooden floor. He kept looking up at the shaft, at the circle of darkness visible above, as if he could see something there that his masters could not. Cormac could not sleep either. He lay in the bunk and listened to his brother's breathing, to Copper's restless movements, to the constant, gentle rush of the water channel. He felt the pressure in his ears, a heaviness that had nothing to do with altitude and everything to do with the weather building somewhere out on the plains. At 4 in the morning, the wind began. The great blizzard of 1888 did not announce itself as a disaster. It began like any snowstorm, with flakes falling steady through the pre-dawn darkness and wind picking up from the northwest. By sunrise, visibility had dropped to a quarter mile. By noon, it had dropped to 20 feet. By evening, it had dropped to nothing at all. A man could not see his own hand held in front of his face, but it was not the snow that made the storm legendary. It was not the wind, though the wind was fierce, gusting to 70 miles per hour, strong enough to knock a man off his feet. It was not even the duration, though the storm would rage for 9 consecutive days without stopping. It was the cold. The temperature, which had been hovering around 15 degrees above zero, began to fall at noon on March 11. By evening, it had reached zero. By midnight, it had reached 20 below. By the following dawn, it had reached 35 below, with the wind making it feel like 60 below. Exposed flesh could freeze in 3 minutes. Metal became brittle and could shatter at a touch. Water froze in midair. Cattle froze standing up, their bodies becoming statues of ice that would remain in the fields until spring. And the storm did not stop. March 12th, March 13th, March 14th. The snow continued to fall. The wind continued to howl. The temperature continued to hover near 40 below zero with the wind chill. In the valley, catastrophe unfolded in slow motion. The Thornwood Ranch lost 23 head of cattle in the first 3 days. Silas Thornwood himself tried to reach them on the second day, fighting through snow that reached his waist and nearly died. His horse found its way back to the barn while he stumbled behind, blind with cold, frost forming on his eyebrows and his beard. Franklin Hollister's house, the one he had built himself and declared the finest in the basin, developed cracks in the walls on the 4th day of the storm. The wind found those cracks and widened them. By the 6th day, the entire north wall had shifted, letting cold air pour into the structure in a constant stream. His family huddled in the kitchen, the only room they could keep warm, and burned furniture for fuel when the firewood ran out. Pastor Brennan's church lost its roof on the fifth day. The weight of the snow, combined with the force of the wind, tore it away as cleanly as if it had been cut with a saw. The pastor and his wife, who lived in rooms attached to the church, found themselves exposed to the full fury of the storm. They moved into their root cellar, the only shelter available, and discovered on the seventh day that it was flooding from snowmelt seeping through the foundation. On the fourth day, Virgil Thornwood, the young man who had thrown pebbles into the well and called the brothers moles, tried to reach the barn to check on the remaining horses. The barn was 30 feet from the house. He could see its outline, barely, through the driving snow. He lost his way. He wandered in the whiteout for 2 hours, unable to find either the barn or the house, before he stumbled into the fence line and followed it back. By then, his hands had been exposed too long. The two smallest fingers on his right hand would never work properly again. Martha Kincaid's husband, trying to reach their own barn on the fourth day, was not as lucky. He lost his way in the whiteout and was found 8 hours later, frozen, less than 50 feet from their back door. He had been walking in circles, and in the keeping place on the ridge, the temperature held steady. 52 degrees. The water flowed in its channel. The air was still and calm. Cormac recorded everything in his notebook, dates and times and temperatures, while above them the worst storm in living memory tried to kill everything it touched. On the sixth day of the storm, a figure appeared at the rim of the well. Cormac heard the voice first, thin and desperate, barely audible over the wind. "Please." He climbed the shaft alone, leaving Declan to tend the fire below. When he emerged into the storm, he could not see more than 2 feet in any direction. The wind was a physical force pushing against him, trying to throw him back into the hole. "Please," the voice said again. He found Silas Thornwood standing at the edge of the well, his face gray with cold, his beard crusted with ice, his eyes wild with desperation. He was carrying his son Virgil on his back. Virgil was not moving. "Please," Silas said. His voice broke on the word. "My boy." His hands. Cormac looked at Virgil's hands. They were wrapped in cloth, but the cloth was frozen stiff, and through the gaps he could see flesh that had turned black. "Come down," Cormac said. "Now." He helped them descend the shaft, Silas first, then Virgil lowered by rope like cargo. The journey down was treacherous, Silas's arms shaking so badly he could barely grip, his feet slipping on the icy stones. But they made it. At the bottom, Declan was waiting with blankets. Copper was barking, short, sharp sounds of alarm and greeting. The warmth of the underground chamber hit Silas like a physical blow, so sudden and so complete that he staggered and nearly fell. After 35 degrees below zero, 52 felt like summer. Steam began rising from their frozen clothing. Ice melted and dripped onto the wooden floor. Cormac looked at Virgil's hands. 2 of the fingers were beyond saving, the flesh already dead. The others might survive with proper care. "We need Dr. Ashford," Cormac said. Declan looked at the shaft, at the howling white fury visible at the top. "I will find him," he said. He climbed up into the blizzard and disappeared. Others came over the next 2 days. The Hollisters arrived on the evening of the 6th day, stumbling through snow that had drifted to 10 feet in places, their faces raw with cold and fear. Franklin Hollister, the man who had declared the keeping place a death trap, could not look Cormac in the eye as he descended the shaft. His wife wept with relief when she felt the warmth of the main room. Their 3 children stood in a row, silent and wide-eyed, not quite believing that they were safe. Pastor Brennan and his wife came on the morning of the 7th day. Their flooded root cellar had finally become uninhabitable, the water rising to their knees, the cold seeping through their clothing until they could not feel their feet. The pastor said nothing as he climbed down. His wife said thank you over and over, the words coming out in a continuous stream that was half prayer and half sob. Martha Kincaid arrived alone on the afternoon of the 7th day. Her face was gray and still, the face of a woman who had buried her husband in a snowbank because the ground was frozen too hard to dig, and who had walked 3 miles through a blizzard because she had no choice. She looked at Cormac at the bottom of the shaft, and something broke in her expression. "I said terrible things," she whispered, "about your grandmother, about you." Cormac did not respond to that. "Come in," he said. "Get warm." The Hendersons came, Their stored supplies were already in the cold cellar. They had simply waited too long to follow them. Dr. Ashford, who had been brought by Declan, stayed when he realized his own house was not safe. He brought his wife and 2 children with him. By the end of the 8th day, 19 people were sheltering in the keeping place. 19 people, plus Copper, in a space designed for 2. The main room was crowded. People sat against the walls, huddled together for warmth that the room was already providing. Children slept in piles, like puppies, wherever they could find space. The air should have grown stale, but the ventilation shaft kept it fresh, just as Grayson had designed it to do. They ate the provisions from the cold cellar. They drank water from the channel. They talked in low voices, sharing stories of what had happened to their homes, their animals, their neighbors. They slept in shifts, some in the main room, some in the sleeping chamber, some in the cold cellar itself, which at 48 degrees was warmer than any of their houses had been in days. On the 3rd night of the refuge, Pastor Brennan led a prayer of thanksgiving. He stood in the center of the crowded room, his voice steady, his hands folded. "Heavenly Father," he said, "we thank you for this shelter from the storm. We thank you for the wisdom of those who built it and the courage of those who maintained it. We thank you for the reminder that your ways are not our ways, that your wisdom exceeds our understanding, that sometimes the most humble places become the most sacred." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was rough with emotion. "Forgive us," he said, "for our pride. Forgive us for thinking we knew better than those who came before us. Forgive us for mocking what we did not understand." He opened his eyes and looked at Cormac. "Amen," he said. Around the room, 19 voices echoed him. "Amen." I want you to pause here. I want you to think about the people in your life who have helped you when you needed it most. The ones who opened their doors when you had nowhere to go. The ones who fed you when you were hungry, sheltered you when you were cold, forgave you when you had wronged them. Now think about this. Would you do the same? If someone who had mocked you, who had dismissed you, who had called you a fool and bet on your failure, came to your door in their moment of greatest need, would you let them in? This is the measure of a person, not what they do when it is easy, but what they do when it is hard. Not what they say when everyone is watching, but what they do when no one would blame them for turning away. Dr. Ashford saved most of Virgil Thornwood's fingers. 2 had to be removed, cut away in a makeshift surgery in the sleeping chamber, while the young man bit down on a leather strap and tried not to scream. But the others, with careful warming and constant attention, survived. Virgil said nothing for the first 3 days. He lay in the sleeping chamber and stared at the stone ceiling and would not speak to anyone, not even his father, who sat beside him hour after hour, with tears running down his weathered face. On the 4th day, Virgil turned his head and looked at Cormac, who had come in to check on him. "I bet $5 you would be crawling back before Christmas," Virgil said. His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. Cormac said nothing. "I was wrong," Virgil said, "about everything, about you, about this place, about your grandmother." His voice broke. "I threw stones at you," he said. "I called you moles. I told everyone you were fools who would freeze to death by New Year." His bandaged hands lay on the blanket, useless and wrapped. "You saved my life," he said. "After everything I did, you saved my life." Cormac looked at the young man he had known since childhood, the bully who had tormented him at church socials, the rich man's son who had never been denied anything. "You needed help," Cormac said simply. That was enough. He left the sleeping chamber and went back to the main room, where Copper was lying by the fire, watching over the refugees with the calm vigilance of a dog who knew his job. On the 9th day, the storm ended. The wind stopped so suddenly that the silence felt like a physical presence, like a weight lifting from the world. The snow continued to fall for another few hours, light and gentle now, and then it stopped too. The clouds broke apart. The sun came through. Cormac climbed the shaft and emerged into a world transformed. The snow was 5 feet deep on the ridge in most places, sculpted into drifts that reached 15 feet where the wind had piled it. The sky was pure blue, the first clear sky in over a week. The temperature was still 10 below zero, but after what they had endured, it felt almost warm. He stood at the rim of the well and looked down at the valley below. From this height, he could see the damage. Rooftops collapsed under the weight of snow. Barns that had stood for decades, now reduced to rubble. Thin columns of smoke rising from various points, the desperate fires of people burning whatever they could find to stay warm. It looked like a battlefield. It looked like the aftermath of a war. One by one, the refugees climbed up to the surface. They emerged into the brilliant white morning, blinking and squinting and breathing air that cut like glass. They looked at the ridge around them, at the damage visible in the valley below, and many of them wept. Cordelia Thornwood was the last to emerge before her husband. She stood at the rim of the well, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She had said terrible things about the Whitmore brothers. She had whispered behind their backs and laughed at their inheritance, and told everyone who would listen that Maeve Whitmore must have hated her grandsons. Now her son was alive because of them. Her family was alive. "I was wrong," Cordelia said. Her voice was barely audible. "About everything. I said such terrible things." She looked at Cormac, and her face crumpled. "My children are alive because of what your grandmother built," she said, "because of what you preserved. I did not deserve to be saved. Not after what I said." Cormac looked at her for a long moment. "You came when you needed help," he said. "That was enough." Cordelia's eyes filled with tears. "I will tell everyone," she said, "everyone who will listen, what this place really is, what your grandmother really gave you." Silas Thornwood emerged last. He stood at the rim of the well, looking at his ranch in the distance, at the damage visible even from here. Collapsed barns, dead livestock, a homestead that would take months to rebuild. Then he turned to Cormac. "I called you fools," Silas said. His voice was rough, worn down by days of cold and fear, and the particular exhaustion of having been catastrophically wrong about everything that mattered. "I called your grandmother crazy. I offered you $200 for land I said was worthless and would collapse before spring." He stopped. His jaw worked, as if the next words were difficult to speak. "I was wrong," he said, "about all of it, and I would have lost my son if not for you, if not for your grandmother, if not for this place that I mocked and dismissed and tried to buy for nothing." He extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, "for saving my family." Cormac shook it. Silas's grip was weak, his fingers still damaged from the cold that had nearly killed him, but his eyes were clear. Franklin Hollister came forward next. He did not offer his hand. He stood with his arms at his sides, his head bowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told everyone you were building a death trap," he said. "I said the engineering was flawed. I said it would collapse under the first hard freeze." He looked up. His eyes were wet. "My engineering collapsed," he said. "My house, my walls, everything I built with my own hands, and this place stood. For 9 days in the worst storm any of us have ever seen, this place stood." He shook his head slowly. "I have been building in this territory for 20 years. I thought I knew everything about construction. I knew nothing. I knew absolutely nothing." He looked at Cormac. "Will you teach me?" he asked. "Will you show me how this was built?" Cormac nodded. "For anyone who wants to learn," he said. "No secrets." Pastor Brennan approached last. He walked slowly, his wife beside him, both of them thin and pale from days of insufficient food and too much fear. His hands were folded in front of him, the way they always were when he spoke from the pulpit. "I said it was ungodly," the pastor said quietly, "living beneath the earth. I said God made man to walk in the light, to dwell under the sky." He closed his eyes for a moment. "I was a fool," he said, "a self-righteous fool. God does not care where we shelter. He cares that we care for each other. He cares that when our neighbors are in need, we open our doors to them, even when they have been unkind, even when they have been cruel." He opened his eyes and looked at Cormac. "You showed more Christian charity in these 9 days than I have shown in 40 years of preaching," he said. "I am sorry for everything I said, for everything I thought." He bowed his head. "Forgive me," he said. Cormac looked at the assembled group, at the people who had mocked him and his brother for months, at the people who had called their grandmother crazy and their inheritance worthless, at the people who had bet on their failure and laughed at their ambition and whispered behind their backs. All of them had come to him in their moment of greatest need. All of them had been welcomed. All of them had survived. This place, Cormac said slowly, was built by a man named Ezekiel Grayson, following the design of our grandmother, Maeve Whitmore. She learned this way of building in Ireland, where her people survived for 2,000 years by going underground when the world above was trying to kill them. He paused. She carried that knowledge across an ocean and held it for 40 years, waiting for the right time to use it. She gave us this place because she believed we would understand what to do with it. He looked at the valley below, at the damage and the destruction and the long work of recovery that lay ahead. We are going to expand it, he said. Make it larger. Make room for more people. So that the next time something like this happens, no one in Elkshade Basin has to die, because they had nowhere safe to go. He turned and looked at his brother, who had emerged from the shaft and was standing beside him, Copper at his side. That is what it is for, Cormac said. That is what she wanted us to understand. The sun rose higher, the snow began to melt at the edges, and one by one, the refugees of the great blizzard of 1888 began the long walk down the mountain to see what remained of their homes. The great blizzard of 1888 killed 31 people in Elkshade Basin and the surrounding counties. Over 2,000 head of livestock perished. 70% of the buildings in the valley suffered significant damage. 3 families lost everything they had and left the territory entirely, never to return. It was the worst natural disaster in the region's recorded history. But in the keeping place on the ridge, no one died. 19 people had sheltered there for the worst of the storm. 19 people had survived because 2 young men had listened to their grandmother and had the courage to act on what they heard. In the weeks that followed, the story spread. First through the valley, as the survivors returned to their damaged homes and began the long work of rebuilding. Then to the neighboring counties as people came to help and heard what had happened on the Whitmore Ridge. Then to the newspapers in Denver, as reporters sought out the details of the disaster and discovered a story that seemed too unlikely to be true. The Rocky Mountain News ran a feature story on the front page of their Sunday edition. The headline read, "The Keeping Place, How 2 Brothers in Celtic Wisdom Saved 19 Lives." Brennan Gallagher was interviewed for the article. He spoke about the soda-rains of Ireland, about the ancient knowledge that had kept his people alive through centuries of hardship, about Maeve Whitmore, and the gift she had given her grandsons. 2,000 years, Gallagher told the reporter. That is how long our people have known how to survive underground. The Romans could not kill us. The English could not starve us. The cold and the dark cannot touch us because we know how to use them. These boys remembered what most people have forgotten, that the old ways are not primitive. They are proven. The story was reprinted in newspapers across the country. Letters arrived at the Whitmore farm from as far away as New York and California, from people who wanted to know more about the keeping place, about the construction techniques, about the principles that had kept 19 people alive when the storm was killing everyone else. Cormac answered every letter. He drew diagrams and wrote explanations. He shared everything his grandmother had taught him, everything Grayson had built, everything he and Declan had learned through trial and error. There were no secrets. The knowledge was too valuable to keep hidden. If this story has touched you, if you have felt something true in the telling of it, I want to ask you to do something. Think about the knowledge you carry, the things you learned from your parents and grandparents, the wisdom that has been passed down through your family for generations. Some of that knowledge might seem outdated now. It might seem primitive or old-fashioned. It might be dismissed by experts who have degrees and credentials and confidence in the new ways of doing things. But the old ways lasted for a reason. They survived because they worked. And sometimes in the worst moments, in the moments when everything modern fails, the old ways are the only things that save us. Hold on to that knowledge. Pass it on. You never know when someone will need it. The spring of 1888 was busy with recovery and rebuilding. The valley slowly put itself back together. Barns were raised, livestock was replaced, the dead were mourned and buried, and on the ridge the keeping place grew. Franklin Hollister, true to his word, became one of Cormac's most dedicated students. He climbed the ridge every week, notebook in hand, studying the construction techniques that had proved so superior to his own. He asked questions constantly, took detailed measurements, And by summer, he had designed 3 new structures based on the same principles to be built on other ridges around the basin. "We cannot prevent storms," Hollister said one afternoon, standing at the rim of the well with Cormac. "But we can prepare for them. We can build places that will stand when everything else falls." Cormac nodded. "That is what she understood," he said. "That is what she wanted us to learn." By the end of 1888, 12 families had signed contracts with the brothers for cold storage through the following winter. The fees they charged remained modest, but the service they provided was increasingly valuable. Root cellars flooded, spring houses froze, grain bins went to mice. The keeping place stayed dry and cold and safe season after season. By 1890, the number of contracts had grown to 23. 3 more keeping places had been built in the valley, all following the same principles, all constructed with the brothers' guidance. The old ways were spreading. Cormac Whitmore married in the spring of 1891. His bride was Sarah, the youngest daughter of Dr. Phineas Ashford. She had been 15 during the Great Blizzard, huddled with her family in the keeping place, watching the young man with the notebook who worked tirelessly to help everyone and never seemed to rest. She had thought then that he was the calmest person she had ever met. She learned later that he was not calm at all, that he simply knew how to hold his fear in a place where it could not control him, that this was something his grandmother had taught him in the stories she had told about Ireland and survival. They had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. All of them learned to read and write in the keeping place during the winter months when the weather made it difficult to travel to the schoolhouse in town. Declan never married. He said, when asked, that he was waiting for the right person. The right person never came, and eventually he stopped waiting and simply lived. He became the keeper of the keeping place in a literal sense, managing the storage contracts and the maintenance and the constant small repairs that any structure required. He knew every stone in the walls, every plank in the floor, every bend in the water channel. He could hear from the quality of the water's sound whether a joint needed attention. He lived in the keeping place year-round after 1895. He said it suited him. He said the earth was company enough. Copper died in the winter of 1899, at the age of 16. He had grown gray around the muzzle and slow in his movements, but he had never lost the habit of lying by the fire and watching the door, ready to greet whoever came down the shaft. On his last morning, he walked slowly to the rim of the well and lay down in a patch of winter sunlight. He put his head on his paws and closed his eyes. When Declan found him an hour later, the dog was gone, as peacefully as if he had simply fallen asleep. They buried him at the rim of the well, in a grave that Cormac dug himself despite the frozen ground. The headstone was simple, carved by Declan with the care he gave to everything. Copper, faithful companion. He was here from the beginning. The decades passed. The keeping place stood through everything the weather could throw at it. It stood through the hard winter of 1899, when temperatures reached 40 below and livestock died by the thousands across the state. The families who stored their provisions in the keeping place lost nothing. It stood through the flood of 1903 when snowmelt turned every creek in the valley into a raging torrent and root cellars from one end of the basin to the other filled with muddy water. The keeping place stayed dry. It stood through the drought of 1911 when springs dried up and wells went empty and people had to haul water from miles away. The channel in the keeping place still flowed, fed by a source deep enough to be unaffected by surface conditions. It stood, and it served, and it saved. In 1920, a researcher from the State College came to study the structure. He spent 3 weeks measuring and documenting, asking questions that Cormac, now 51 years old, answered with the patience of a man who had answered similar questions many times before. The researcher's name was Dr. William Harker. He published his findings in an engineering journal that few people read, but that established, for the scientific record, what had always been true. The Whitmore keeping place, he wrote, demonstrates thermal efficiency approximately 2.4 times greater than conventional construction methods of the same era. The earth-sheltered design, combined with the thermal mass of the stone walls and the temperature-moderating effects of the water channel, creates an internal environment of remarkable stability regardless of external conditions. The original builders, working from traditional knowledge rather than formal engineering principles, achieved results that modern science is only beginning to understand. This structure represents not a primitive approach to construction, but a sophisticated one, tested over millennia and proven through countless winters. Cormac read the article, smiled slightly, and put it in the wooden box where he kept his grandmother's letter and Grayson's correspondence. The old ways, he said to Declan that evening, sitting by the fire with Copper's successor, a young dog named Russet, sleeping at their feet. The old ways always come back. They have to. They are too good to stay forgotten. Declan nodded. His own hair was gray now, his hands worn from years of working the stone. But his eyes were still the same gray-green they had always been. She would be pleased, Declan said. She always knew, Cormac said. She always knew. Cormac Whitmore died in the spring of 1926, at the age of 57. He had been writing in his notebook that morning, recording observations as he had every morning for nearly 40 years. The temperature in the keeping place, the level of the water in the channel, the condition of the joints in the timbers. He felt a pain in his chest, sharp and sudden. He set down his pen. He leaned back in his chair. When Declan found him an hour later, the notebook was open on the table, the last entry complete. The temperature had been 52 degrees. The water had been flowing clear. Everything had been in order. The funeral was held at the Ridge, as Cormac had requested. His children and grandchildren came from across the state. Old friends came from the valley. Even Virgil Thornwood came, his right hand still missing 2 fingers, to pay respects to the man who had saved his life 40 years before. Pastor Brennan's successor, a younger man who had heard the stories but never lived them, spoke words that were kind but inadequate. Declan spoke after him. My brother believed in things that most people could not see, Declan said. He believed in our grandmother's wisdom when everyone said she was crazy. He believed in this place when everyone said it would collapse. He believed that the old ways mattered when everyone said only the new ways were worth learning. He paused, looking out at the gathered faces. He was right about all of it. They buried Cormac beside Copper, at the rim of the well, overlooking the valley where he had been born. The headstone carried the same words that Ezekiel Grayson had carved into the wall 55 years before, for those who come after. Declan Whitmore lived another 12 years, dying peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1938 at the age of 69. He was found in the main room of the keeping place, sitting in his chair by the fire, his hands folded in his lap. Russet, who was old himself by then, lay at his feet. His face was peaceful. He had spent his whole life in the keeping place, and he had died there, in the home his grandmother had designed and his brother had preserved. The keeping place was empty of human occupants after that. The storage contracts had dwindled over the years as refrigeration became common and the need for underground cold storage diminished. The Whitmore family still owned the land, but no one lived on the ridge anymore. But the structure remained. In 1952, researchers from Colorado State University visited the site as part of a study of historic underground construction. They found the well intact, the shaft accessible, the chambers below still dry and stable after 80 years. The water still flowed in its channel. The temperature still held steady at 52 degrees. They took measurements and photographs and wrote reports. They confirmed what Dr. Harker had written 30 years before. The keeping place was an achievement that defied conventional expectations, built by people who should not have known what they knew, using techniques that predated modern engineering by millennia. It worked because the old ways worked. It lasted because the old ways lasted. The Elkshade Historical Society took over maintenance of the site in 1978. They installed a proper staircase down the shaft, replacing the rope that visitors had been using for nearly a century. They added lighting and ventilation. They made it safe for visitors, and they put up a plaque at the rim of the well. The Whitmore Keeping Place, built 1871 by Ezekiel Grayson, following designs by Maeve Whitmore, based on Celtic souterrain construction. This structure saved 19 lives during the Great Blizzard of 1888 and served as cold storage for Elkshade Basin for over 50 years. It remains as a testament to the wisdom of traditional knowledge and the vision of those who dared to build something different. The keeping place still stands today. You can visit it if you like, anytime between May and October. You can climb down the stairs that replaced the old rope. You can stand in the main room where 19 people sheltered during the worst storm in Colorado history. You can see the water still flowing in its channel, hear its steady rush, Feel the cool, still air that never varies more than a few degrees. You can read Ezekiel Grayson's message carved into the stone, built for Maeve, for those who come after. And if you are quiet, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear them. The brothers who believed when no one else did. The grandmother who carried ancient knowledge across an ocean and held it close until the right moment came. The dog who watched over them all. The skeptics who became believers. The community that learned, in the hardest possible way, that sometimes the old ways are the only ways that work. They are all gone now. But what they built remains. The water still flows. The temperature still holds. The keeping place still keeps. I want to leave you with one final thought. Maeve Whitmore carried a secret across an ocean and held it for 40 years. She waited for the right moment to pass it on. She waited for someone who would understand. She found them, her grandsons, two young men who were willing to listen, willing to learn, willing to work, willing to believe in something that everyone else dismissed as worthless. They proved her right. They saved lives. They built something that lasted. And now their story has reached you. What will you do with it? What knowledge are you carrying that the world has dismissed as old-fashioned, as primitive, as worthless? What gifts have you received from those who came before you that you have not yet fully understood? Think about it. The answer might be more important than you know. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. And remember, the keeping place still stands. The old ways still work. And sometimes the most valuable things we inherit are not things at all, but ways of seeing, ways of building, ways of keeping what matters safe until the world is ready to understand. Until next time. The Whitmore Keeping Place can be visited from May through October. The temperature inside, summer or winter, remains 52 degrees. The water still flows, and the words carved into the stone still read, "For those who come after."